Welcome, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar hosted by the Hoover Institution's Center for Revitalizing American Institutions. My name is Erin Tillman, and I serve as an Associate Director at the Hoover Institution, and will be serving as your webinar host for today's session. Before we begin, let's review a few housekeeping items. Today's session will consist of a discussion followed by a question and answer period. To submit a question, please use the Q&A feature located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. While we may not have time to address all questions, we will do our best to respond to as many as possible. A recording of this webinar will be available on the RAI event page of the Hoover website at hoover.org/RAI within the next 3 to 4 business days. The Center for Revitalizing American Institutions, also known as RAI, was established to study the reasons behind the crisis in trust facing American institutions. We analyze how they are operating in practice and consider policy recommendations to rebuild trust and increase their effectiveness. RAI operates as the Hoover Institution's first ever center and is a testament to one of our founding principles, ideas advancing freedom. Since 1919, the Hoover Institution has sought to improve the human condition by advancing ideas that promote economic opportunity and prosperity while securing and safeguarding peace for America and all mankind. Today's webinar is the second of our 2025-26 series, Reimagining American Institutions, in which we feature speakers who are developing innovative ideas, conducting groundbreaking research, and taking important actions to improve trust and efficacy in America's institutions. It gives me great pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Brandice Canes-Wrone. Brandice is the Maurice R. Greenberg Senior Fellow and Director of the Center for Revitalizing American Institutions here at the Hoover Institution. She's also professor of political science and professor by courtesy of political economics at the Graduate School of Business here at Stanford. She served on faculty at MIT, Northwestern, and Princeton before returning to the farm in 2022. Today's topics will be on electoral reforms that have the potential to shape and hopefully improve American politics. Couldn't be a more timely discussion for today. We are fortunate to have 3 scholars who have recently co-edited a book on the subject, Electoral Reform in the United States, Proposals for Combating Polarization and Extremism. Full introductions of each of our distinguished guests would require nearly all the time we have for today's webinar, so we'll keep our introductions brief. But more complete biographies are available on the Hoover webinar webpage. Larry Diamond is the William L. Clayton Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution and the Mosbacher Senior Fellow in Global Democracy at Stanford's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. Larry co-founded the Journal of Democracy and is deeply committed to educating and engaging the next generation of democratic leaders, both here in the U.S. and abroad. As a Bass University Fellow and through efforts with the Center for Democracy, Development, and Rule of Law. And Larry, as a lifelong Dodgers fan, congratulations. What an incredible final game. Ned is the Eversold Chair in Constitutional Law at the Ohio State University and directs its electoral law program. Ned writes frequently for the general public on topics concerning the protection and improvement of democracy, and he curates the Common Ground Democracy Substack. He's a contributing columnist with the Washington Post, and his commentary is regularly featured in the Atlantic, Politico, and elsewhere. He has written 2 important books on elections, Ballot Battles and Presidential Elections and Majority Rule, both of which are rooted in rigorous scholarship, but also accessible to the educated public. Thanks, Ned Foley, for joining us. And our third guest, Rick Pildes, is the Sedler Family Professor of Constitutional Law at NYU School and is a leading expert on legal issues concerning the democratic process and the structure of American government. Like Ned, Rick is frequently tapped by a variety of media outlets to discuss election issues. He has worked as an analyst with NBC and CNN and has published in a wide range of national publications. He is co-author of the widely used casebook, The Law of Democracy, and has held visiting professor roles at the University of Chicago Law School, Harvard Law School, and Yale Law School. Thank you, Larry, Rick, and Ned for joining us today. I'll now hand you off to Brandice to start today's conversation.
Thanks so much, Erin, and thanks, Rick, Ned, and Larry for being here today with us. So I've got a copy of your great recent book. In it, Electoral Reform in the United States, you proposed a series of reforms that would reduce polarization and extremism in the U.S. So I thought we'd start off with, why do you think polarization and extremism are problems for our country today? Rick, do you want to take the lead here?
Sure, Brandice, and thank you very much. Thank you, Stanford and RAI, for not just hosting this, but for the efforts you're making in this space. I could say a lot of things about why polarization and extremism are problems in the United States, but I'll start off with maybe two. The first is there's a lot of data we have, empirical studies that strongly suggest the American public is not nearly as polarized as our elected officials are, particularly in Congress. And so that raises real questions about whether there are features of our electoral processes, our electoral structures, that generate members of Congress in particular who are more polarized than voters and citizens tend to be. And so if voters are not actually getting what they want, or if the majority is not actually having its preferences about candidates reflected in who gets elected, if more polarizing figures are being elected than the actual electorate prefers, that's a real problem. It's a problem in the basic principle of majority rule, that the majority should have the ability to choose its representatives, and hopefully their decisions then reflect policy preferences of the majority. But there's a distortion there. It seems pretty clear there's a distortion that polarization reflects. A second problem with polarization, particularly in the American context, is that with our bicameral system in Congress and our separated power system, it's very difficult for the American system of political lawmaking to function with highly polarized political parties. Polarization can be, reasonable in certain circumstances. I mean, there are reasons to be polarized at times, but again, if the polarization doesn't reflect what voters actually want, and it makes our institutions much more dysfunctional, that's a second and serious problem for the American system. Because to step back even a little bit further, I think one of the fundamental challenges democracies across the West are having is over the last 10 to 15 years, they seem to be unable to deliver effectively on the issues that lots of their citizens care about. And when a democratic system can't actually deliver on the issues that lots of their citizens care about, it's a very dangerous context for democracies. It can lead to alienation, anger, distrust, and the like. It can lead to, even worse circumstances and sort of yearnings for strongman figures who can claim to cut through all of this dysfunction.
Yep.
So I think polarization, if it doesn't reflect the electorate, that's a problem. If it leads to government dysfunction, that's a problem. And then also we can talk about extremism maybe a bit later, but it feeds into a political culture that has become increasingly toxic and tribalistic. And that's extremely unhealthy also in a democratic system.
Yes, yes, and I'll just add, you started with the point on and return to it, the preferences match, whether the preferences of the electorate are as polarized. And our own Mofi Arena here at Hoover and RAI has done a lot of, not the only, but a lot of that foundational research. So that's a point near and dear to our heart. Ned, did you want to add to some of Rick's comments?
Sure. And let me echo first Rick's thanks and appreciation for this event and for all that you're doing on this topic. And I do want to add in the sense that I agree with everything that Rick said, so I won't repeat that. But maybe one additional point that might be useful is that if there is a situation in which the electorate is polarized, it's a special challenge for democracy to yield a majority outcome. And there is this fear that polarization among elites or in Congress can breed polarization within the electorate, even if it didn't start out there, because the tribalism takes root in the culture, not just within the legislature. So just to be very simplistic about this, if you have 40% of the public on one side, 40% on the other side, so neither side has a majority of 50% or more, but there's sort of 20% in the middle, it's a real challenge to figure out what should be the most representative way to have a democracy given the polarization of views. And that's particularly true when the goal is a single winner election, which most of our elections are. Some of them have to be. When we elect a governor, there can only be one governor. When we elect a senator, one senator at a time from a state, there can only be one winner. And many of our legislatures are structured to be single member winner districts. And so how you pick a single winner when the electorate itself is polarized is extremely challenging. And this has been recognized for a long time. Some of the leading political science works of the middle of the 20th century explicitly noted that it's hard to just construct democracy under these conditions. So Robert Dahl, who was considered a great political scientist of the 20th century, made that in one of his seminal books, and likewise Anthony Downs, who wrote about how to construct democracy to find that median voter right in the middle, also said it's really hard to do under conditions of polarization. So the more we can avoid it, in the way that Rick was saying, that we could undo distortions that may exacerbate the situation, the better off we'll be. And to the extent that we have it, we should try to ameliorate it by trying to find as much common ground in representation as possible.
Larry?
Well, I don't need to add much. I'd say if there's a problem with this this webinar is that you have three co-editors who help to organize and launch a project who are, in philosophy and approach, are pretty much aligned. So the only thing I wish to add, and this might put it in more of a global context for just a moment before we come back to the United States, is to, kind of theoretically and philosophically endorse Ned's last point. And it goes all the way back to Aristotle, actually, in writing about democracy, about the importance of, moderation and the dangers of tyrants and extremism and really populism giving vent to that when the floodgates of polarization are opened. And so more broadly, what democracies need to survive for the long run is a political culture of, not always just moderate candidates, but of compromise, of flexibility, negotiation, the very opposite, Brandice, of course, of what's happening now in the Congress with the government shutdown. And what you see when you look at, we're in an era globally of democratic backsliding. Quite a number of democracies have either failed or are in pretty serious trouble around the world. And almost invariably, if you look at the contributing factors, political polarization, and then the incentive that extreme party polarization generates toward maximizing power, violating rules, and going down a kind of authoritarian pathway. It's a very, very common formula for democratic decay.
Thanks. So each of you in the book and elsewhere in other kind of writings and commentary outside the book have not only identified these problems, but also have reforms that could be adopted in the US at various levels of government to try to turn the ship here and have preferences better represented and encourage the sort of compromise, Larry, that you were just talking about. Would you like to lead in talking about, I think you each here maybe we won't have complete agreement, unlike the first question. Not complete disagreement, but some differences in the reforms you might most prioritize advocating. Larry, would you like to say a bit
Okay,
about
well,
the one you'd most advocate?
Yeah, as you know, Brandice, from having participated in our project,
Yeah.
there was certainly not consensus in the project.
Yeah.
And I think the big, so there are three big places where you can land in terms of thinking about what kind of electoral system would be good for the United States. One place where you can land is to say, well, we have the system we inherited from the British of first past the post. Whoever gets the most votes in a single member district, whether it's a majority or 38%, in a final election, they win. And that's the system in Britain, in Canada, in India, and in a lot of countries that inherited the British tradition. That has been, of course, fused in the United States into a method for nominating candidates in party primaries that isn't exactly the same, for example, in Britain or India or something. And so that creates its own dynamic. Um, Now, the places where you can land are just to kind of map it out. You can say, I like single member districts because they generate a two-party system that's stable, it's clear, it's interpretable. And either I like or don't like the current system of partisan primaries, which is what prevails in most states. Secondly, you can say, no, really, kind of building on the point that Rick was starting to introduce, we would have a better, fairer, maybe more democratic system if winners in elections more broadly represented the electorate, so that you couldn't win in a general election with 38% of the vote. There would either have to be a French-style runoff, a two-ballot system, or ranked choice voting, where voters rank their choices, and then you have the instant runoffs to choose. I don't think there was anyone in our task force that really favored the French style system, just because we've got primaries, then we have a general election. Oh my God, a third election. It's a lot to ask of voters. Louisiana does it, but there's not a lot of enthusiasm for that. And then the third option, which isn't represented on this webinar now, but did have some significant support in our working group, particularly from authors like Lee Drutman and Jennifer McCoy, is proportional representation. And if you want, we could talk later why none of the three editors are enthusiastic about that as a formula for reducing polarization. So for me, just to kind of introduce the idea and then hand it off to my two colleagues, I think ranked choice voting is the way to go, because it's not a radical reform. You wouldn't have to change the idea of people running in single districts as opposed to PR with multi-member districts. It wouldn't lead to a radical fragmentation of the party system. You would probably still have, a two-party system. Maybe, you'd have a third party here and there that might make headway from the center out, with new possibilities under ranked choice voting. But it would, I think, lean toward moderation and representation, and would punish political appeals that narrowcast, that just try to mobilize a narrow base. So there's a logic of kind of rewarding or inducing moderation and broad appeals. And I'll just say finally, to open it up, because then there's so many ways that this could be structured, right? And has been structured in different alternatives that have been presented to the voters in different states. I really favor combining this with nonpartisan primaries. And the one state that has combined them is Alaska, which has the top four system. There's a nonpartisan primary to choose the top four finishers in a primary. And then those top four people, whatever their party is, Republican, Democrat, Independent, Libertarian, they advance to the general election and ranked choice voting is used. And I could say more about why I like that, but I'll turn it over to my colleagues.
Thanks. Okay, yeah, we're going to come back to ranked choice voting several times. So we want to hear a bit more about that in a moment. Rick, you have some other reforms, not necessarily in opposition to ranked choice voting, but distinct from, that I think that the book and your own commentary suggests should be prioritized.
Well, I want to say a little bit more about the unified primary or the all-candidate primary. When I think about political reforms to address polarization and extremism, I try to think about reforms that, on the one hand, are reasonably practical to imagine, and on the other hand, would give us the biggest bang for the buck. So I don't focus on reforms that would require a constitutional amendment, for example. So among those reforms, one of the ones that I think our experience already shows is likely to make a difference on polarization and extremism is the one Larry mentioned, which is the unified political primary. I don't like the term nonpartisan primary, by the way, because in these unified or all-candidate primaries, candidates can list the party that they affiliate with, so you have a party label. But the all-candidate primary is a response to something we have learned over time about how the traditional party primary works. And I should mention, Larry already alluded to this, most democracies do not use primary elections to choose the party nominees for office. It's usually the party in government that chooses who the candidates will be, or the party leadership. It's not an open electoral process as we use in the United States. And at the time primaries were introduced in the early 20th century, they were heralded as ways that citizens could kind of recapture control from corrupt party machines and the like. But over time, what we've learned is turnout in primary elections is extremely low, tends to be about a third of the general election. The primary electorate is not a representative of the general electorate, let alone citizens more generally. It's not representative along a number of different dimensions. And one of the things the traditional party primary can do is it can filter out candidates who would actually have the broadest appeal in the general election if they could get through to the general election. But they can't get through a party primary with this unrepresentative primary electorate. And so voters in the general election are sometimes faced with two choices, neither of which really appeals to the broad general electorate, but that's what people are forced to choose between. And so what the all-candidate primary does, depending on the way it's structured, but if we use Alaska as an example, which has been using it for a number of years now, several years now, anyone can run in the primary. You identify yourself in whatever way you want, Republican, Democrat, Independent, whatever. And the top four vote getters go on to the general election. And what that means, just as a starting point, is anybody who's got 25% of the electorate's support is going to go on to the general election instead of being eliminated in a traditional party primary. And so it encourages people to run who might not be able to get through a traditional party primary, but believe they actually would have broad support in the electorate. It ensures that people that have at least 25% support go on to the general election. And then in the general election, now you have 4 candidates. So you don't want a factional candidate to win election. That's not a great way to design things. So you don't want somebody who gets 30% of the vote to become senator or governor. So you can use something like ranked choice voting or instant runoff voting in the general election. And that means the candidate who has the broadest appeal in the general election will actually be the candidate who is selected. Now, if there is a broad center of the electorate that is not effectively represented by the traditional party primary in a state, this system will allow that broad centrist electorate to have candidates in the general election it supports, and to have those candidates win if they truly have broad majority support in the general electorate. It doesn't necessarily mean moderate candidates or more centrist candidates would win. It means candidates that have the broadest appeal in any particular electorate will win. So if you have a state that's very sort of very strong, a very strongly blue state, a very strongly red state, the candidate who wins will reflect that. But if you have an electorate that is more moderate or more centrist, and that's where the majority of the electorate resides, then that majority will be able to express its preferences. And one reason I like this reform is it doesn't require congressional action. It doesn't require a constitutional amendment. It can be done state by state. As I say, Alaska has adopted it already. Most likely, it would be adopted in states that have direct democracy procedures where voters can make this choice, because it's very unlikely you'll get legislatures to adopt this choice, at least in the first instance. But among the various reforms I like, that's one that I think would have the strongest effect, at least in jurisdictions that actually have a broad electorate that is not being adequately represented under the current traditional party primary process. I'm happy to talk about other things involving districting or campaign finance, but maybe we should wait on any of that.
Okay, yeah, we'll come back to some of that. Thanks. Ned, you're, if you don't mind my saying so, somewhat known for promoting Condorcet voting, in a positive way. And I'm not sure every audience member knows exactly what Condorcet voting means. So it might be great if you could give a brief, description of that and why you think it's the, such an important reform to push for.
Sure, thanks. And I should say my advocacy of Condorcet voting builds on the ideas that Larry and Rick has already talked about, because Larry talked about ranked choice voting, which is voters using a ranked ballot to indicate their first choice preference, second choice preference, third choice preference, et cetera. And you can use ranked ballots to conduct what I'll talk about as Condorcet voting. You just tabulate those ballots in a different way from the conventional way of tabulating those ballots, which is the instant runoff method. The instant runoff method eliminates the candidate with the fewest first choice votes and then redistributes the ballots to the other candidates. And we'll talk in a minute about what Condorcet would do. And the reason why the Condorcet voting principle builds on what Rick was talking about is you could have that nonpartisan primary or all candidates primary as the first round of your electoral system, the way Alaska does. And then you could use Condorcet voting for the final round, the general election. Again, you could do that with ranked ballots, or you could do it sometimes with a different kind of ballot that we can talk about. So I would say that Condorcet voting is a subset of the reforms that Larry and Rick are already talking about. And I would say the reason why we should be thinking about it is it's stronger medicine for combating polarization and extremism. It does it more effectively and achieve the goals that all three of us prefer. So why is that? So why do we call it Condorcet voting? It's because it comes from a French mathematician named the Marquis de Condorcet. And it's basically a principle. And the principle is the winner of an election should be the candidate whom a majority of voters prefer to each other opponent in the election when two candidates are considered in pairs, two at a time, head to head against each other. And if you think about it, that's a natural idea of trying to represent the concept of majority rule. So if some other electoral method comes up with some other winner, call that winner Smith. What Condorcet voting comes along and says, well, wait a second, there's another candidate in the same election named Jones that a majority would rather have than Smith. So if a majority prefers Jones to Smith, shouldn't Jones win instead of Smith? Most people say, well, yes, if you want the broadest support, because by definition, the majority support in a divided society is going to have the broadest support. So this Condorcet voting is really this principle that we should find the truest majority winner in an election. And the reason why it's different in implementation is because it structures these head-to-head competitions. Again, you can structure that head-to-head competition by using the rankings on ranked ballots, or you could just have the ballot itself be the head-to-head competitions. The easiest way to see this is if we had a 3-candidate general election. And so we have the all-candidate primary that Rick and Larry have been talking about, and that sends 3 candidates to the November ballot. And voters would vote on their November ballot, candidate A versus candidate B, who do you prefer? Candidate B versus candidate C, who do you prefer? And then candidate A versus candidate C, who do you prefer? Those are the 3 head-to-head contests that exist in a 3-candidate election looked at from the Condorcet perspective. And what Condorcet principle would say is that if there's a candidate among those 3 who beats the other 2 head-to-head, and so is majority preferred over each of the other head-to-head, that's the candidate that should win the election. And that will be the least polarizing, least extreme, most common ground candidate, which is why it's a really good method for combating polarization. If you want, we could go into the details of how, in certain circumstances, it could yield a different winner than the use of the instant runoff method when you're still using an all-candidate primary and you're still using the same ranked ballots. So instant runoff gives you one winner, Condorcet voting would give you a different winner.
Okay, thanks. These reforms, some of them at least, in various forms, have actually been adopted in places in the United States. One of the great things about our country is this possibility for different states and localities to use procedures, as Rick said, without a congressional statute or a constitutional amendment in at least some types of reforms. So I think it's worth taking a step back and thinking about how, where it has been adopted, how has it worked in practice? Has it reduced polarization from what, again, knowing that these are kind of early in evaluations, and what are the challenges in getting it adopted? Larry, I want to start with you because on this day, post-election day last year, we were looking at returns where ranked choice voting reform was in one form or another on the ballot in 6 states, and it lost in 5. And so how should we think about, its prospects for the future, as well as how it's been working in the places it has been adapted?
Thanks, Brandice. Well, we've had about, I don't know, a 15-year period or so of electoral mobilization, political mobilization, mainly from good governance reformers and moderate camps for ranked choice voting, mostly at the municipal level. So if you look at most of the places that use ranked choice voting now, it's cities in the United States, a growing number of them, actually. And you can identify instances. I think San Francisco is the most recent one where the moderate candidate, what I would call the creative center, won. And I think Daniel Lurie is going to do interesting things as a slightly unconventional mayor of San Francisco, because he's not trying to, appeal to this narrow identity group or that. He's really trying to think, how do we make San Francisco a more livable city? So he's one of the poster children for this. But the most prominent national one is Lisa Murkowski. And you will recall, as Americanist political scientist, that she actually lost a Republican primary 2 cycles ago or so, or 3, maybe in 2010 or something, ran as an independent and narrowly won. But then that's a hard act to repeat. And so in the last Alaska Senate election, with Donald Trump in the White House, she would not have won the Republican primary. That would have gone to a more MAGA supporting candidate, but she was one of the top 4, and she came from behind to, in the popular vote on the first preference votes to win. And I don't think it's a coincidence that she is the most independent voting, most independent minded Republican senator today. In terms of the electoral bloodbath for ranked choice voting last November, so there were 6 states that had ranked choice voting on the ballot. One, Alaska, already had it, and there was a very concerted campaign to repeal it. And that campaign failed by only about 600 votes. But it failed, interestingly, with a massive turnout of Alaskan Native Americans who had come to like ranked choice voting, in part because it had helped to elect the first Native American Alaska Congresswoman, a Democrat. And then in Nevada, a similar system to ranked choice voting, slightly more inclusive, top 5, had won in the a statewide initiative in 2022, but the Alaska Constitution requires that constitutional amendments have to be adopted in 2 successive elections. So it won in 2022 and lost in 2024. And I think one of the 2 reasons why ranked choice voting was defeated in some form or another in these 5 other states, including Nevada, Colorado, Arizona, and so on, is that there was a Republican wave in 2024. There was a lot of momentum behind Trump. He and his supporters were strongly against these, and it was very hard for kind of good government reformers, in my view, to get the kind of oxygen in that national campaign to really make their case. And I'll just add one other thing, in the spirit of, I think it was Tip O'Neill who said all politics is local. Well, that's not exactly true, because there was a national context I just described, but I think there were particular circumstances that helped to bring this down in individual states in terms of turnout, in terms of ballot, the wording of the ballot initiative. And in Colorado, for example, the ballot initiative was worded in a very obscure and confusing way. And in Oregon, which you'd think would have been a kind of state that would like something like this, the Democratic Party establishment came out against it. And that's part of the problem for ranked choice voting, is that most party establishments, Democrat or Republican, Republican more than Democrat, aren't enthusiastic about it because they don't want more competition.
Okay, interesting. Rick, I know there's some overlap with the all candidate primary forum and ranked choice voting, but there's also places that don't have ranked choice voting, for instance, that have at least some form of, I'm trying not to use the word nonpartisan primaries, because you can have, as you said, the,
All
but
candidate
all
primaries.
candidate primaries, thank you. Could you say a bit about, how you think that's worked in practice in terms of helping to reduce
Brandice, I'm not
polarization?
exactly sure
Okay.
what you're referring to. If you're,
Okay.
if you're talking,
California, for example.
That's what I was thinking
Oh,
of. Yeah,
I see.
today
Oh.
looking at home.
Yes.
You know.
So, okay, so to step back a little bit, a lot of people have been frustrated over a number of years by what the electoral system is producing in terms of candidates that they then have the ability to vote for in the general election. And reforms prior to the more recent ones took place in places like California and Washington and Alaska. One form these reforms took, which are all motivated by similar kinds of concerns, was what was called the blanket primary, which
Yes,
California and Washington and Alaska had for a brief period of time, which was kind of a crazy quilt kind of system in which you could vote in whatever primary you wanted for whichever office you wanted. So you could vote in the Democratic primary for governor, the Republican primary for treasurer, the Libertarian Party, primary for some other office. But the motivation for that was similar to what we've been describing, which is the sense that the traditional party primary was not giving people the full range of choices they wanted. So anyway, the Supreme Court struck that down as unconstitutional, and then California and Washington went to this top two primary structure, in which everyone runs on the same primary ballot. You could identify yourself as Republican or Democrat or independent or whatever. Top two go to the general election, and then voters choose. The problem that has emerged with top two is you don't always have enough choice in the general election. So you could end up with two Democrats in the general election, which in a state like California happens not infrequently in statewide races. And if you have two Democrats in the general election, a lot of Republicans won't show up. And so the reason the shift has taken place towards this top four structure or top five structure is to address that situation. And so now in a top four system like Alaska's, as we've talked about, you only need 25% to get to the general election. And that means the two major parties are virtually always going to get at least one candidate into the general election. They may get two, maybe each party will get two, maybe one party will get two, and there'll be an independent. But we've come to think, at least many in the political reform community, that the top four does a better job of realizing the objectives that were initially behind the top two primary structure that was first adopted in California and Washington. And you alluded to this earlier. I mean, sorry, I've been fighting off a cold.
Yes, sorry.
In the American system, we've had a tremendous amount of political reform over the generations because we do have a decentralized election system. We do have federalism. We have very important races at the state and local level. And a lot of significant political reforms and reforms to the political process have begun in the states. And then you get experience. In fact, you can see what works, what doesn't work, as we've just been discussing. And if some consensus emerges that certain reforms are producing desirable consequences, it becomes easier to then make the case at the national level, to the extent there's power at the national level to regulate elections, which there is for at least for national elections. You can demonstrate the success of these policies, and then it makes it easier to make the case at the national level. But on the question you asked Larry about what we know about the experience with the all-candidate primary in Alaska, at least the top 4 version, Lisa Murkowski is the most notable candidate who would not have been elected to the Senate under the traditional party primary structure in her most recent election, but does have very broad support within Alaska and was able to get elected under the all-candidate primary structure. That structure also applies to state legislative elections in Alaska. And there have been studies about how the legislative process in Alaska has been functioning under the top 4 primary structure. And what those studies show is that before this change was made, when Alaska still had the traditional kind of party primary system for choosing nominees, you ended up with a much more polarized legislature and much more conflict within the legislature. And that once this change to the all-candidate primary was made, and candidates who had the broadest appeal in their districts or their jurisdictions were able to get elected, it actually produced enough less extreme political figures that the legislature is generally viewed as having functioned much more productively in terms of budget policy and other kind of major issues facing Alaska. So we have experience not just at the national level with the U.S. Senate or the U.S. House, but also with the state legislature in Alaska. And I have to say, those experiments so far are largely confirming the theory and the hopes of reform advocates.
Great. Ned, could you say a bit about Condorcet voting? I mean, I know there could be empirical evidence, both from more academic studies, if there's anything on the ground, but also kind of what are the challenges? Because it's probably, correct me if I'm wrong, had a bit less traction on the ground than ranked choice voting and all candidate primary reform.
Sure. So yeah, just to be upfront about it, Condorcet voting has not yet been implemented. It would be a new reform. I think there are historical reasons that we could go into if we wanted as to why the instant runoff tabulation method became the conventional method. Historically, both in Australia first and then the United States, if you were going to use the ranked ballot, and so it just sort of happened that we did it by the instant runoff method. There's a lot of computer simulated elections that show the difference between using an instant runoff tabulation versus using a Condorcet tabulation. And the more polarized an electorate is, the more divergence there is between these two tabulation methods in terms of achieving results that are closer to the median voter. According to all of these computer studies. I think probably the easiest way for the audience maybe to understand what are the trade-offs or how to think about the difference between these two ideas is just to go back to last year's presidential election. Not that we could have adopted Condorcet voting beforehand, but I think we would all agree that for a long time in the run-up to the election, there was kind of a search for a center lane. Joe Manchin thought about trying to run and as an independent candidate, but he didn't want to be a spoiler. Larry Hogan, as a moderate Republican, also thought about trying to run as an independent, didn't want to be a spoiler. That No Labels group really thought it wanted to do that, but again, it got a lot of negative attention because of the role it would play as a spoiler under our current system. Nikki Haley ran within the Republican primary, but tried to run a campaign as sort of a third alternative. Again, remember, this was when Biden was still going to be the Democratic nominee and Trump was going to be the Republican nominee, and Nikki Haley was saying, "I'm a new generation. I'm a third alternative that's not the old, tired alternatives that you have." But it was impossible to create that middle lane under our existing system. But if we think about either the California top two system transposed into a presidential election, or the Alaska top four system using instant runoff voting, both of those systems would have replicated the same result. Even if you had had a centrist, whether it's Larry Hogan or Nikki Haley or Joe Manchin on the ballot, given polarization, we know that that candidate would have gotten fewer first choice votes and would have been eliminated, and the top two candidates in a top two system, or the final two candidates in the runoff system, would have been Trump and Kamala Harris when she replaced Biden. So both of those reforms in an election of that type, and I'm using this as an example, I could talk about a lot of Ohio elections that would have the same phenomenon, or North Carolina elections or other elections, where you're just going to replicate the same choice between a MAGA extreme Republican versus a Democrat. On the other hand, if you use the Condorcet system and you have that third candidate in there getting through on either a top three system, top four system, top five system, the head-to-head methodology of the Condorcet tabulation at least gives that third candidate the chance that they could show that they're majority preferred against the other two. No guarantee that that candidate is going to win. It might be that Trump is majority preferred over Joe Manchin plus Kamala Harris, or Larry Hogan plus Kamala Harris, or Nikki Haley plus Kamala Harris. But you can't tell that under top two or instant runoff. If you have the Condorcet system, you can actually tell if that third candidate is majority preferred to the other two. And if they are majority preferred, they ought to win.
Can I?
Thanks.
Can I just make a couple brief points? One is, I really have a problem with top two in California, Washington, both on philosophical grounds and practical grounds. Philosophically, bear in mind, as Nate said, or maybe it was Rick, turnout in primaries generally is very low. And maybe Rick said this, a third of the general election turnout, so average 20% turnout of eligible voters, something like that. And so philosophically, I have a problem with the choice in November, the only names on the ballot being narrowed that decisively, that early, by such a small percentage of the electorate. And then practically, I'll just kind of note this because I think this is where we may be headed in California in 2026. If there's just, let's say you have a Democrat-leaning state, which California certainly is, and there are a lot of Democratic candidates in the all-candidate primary, but only one principal Republican candidate, or maybe two. So you're going to have a Republican in the primary in November, but the Democratic vote is going to be fragmented among 8 or 9 candidates. You could have a Democratic candidate emerge from that 8 or 9 contest, particularly now that, big names like Kamala Harris are out of the race, that's very far to the left. And then people, the majority of the electorate would feel unrepresented in the general election. So I think it's not a desirable system.
Okay, thanks. We want to move to questions in a moment, but first I want to just say I want to give you all a chance to say a little bit about the election results that came in last night, and continue to come in. I know there are others that other people may ask about different election results in the Q&A. I'm going to relate them a bit to my own questions to the conversation here. You know, we've talked about ranked choice voting. One of the most publicized elections this year, of course, happened in New York City, which had ranked choice voting in the primary, but not the general. And it's worth thinking about, you know, would it have made a difference if New York City, do you think, had it in the general? And I ask that at two levels. I mean, there's the, would it have made a difference if it was sort of superimposed a week before the election? But of course, you know, as scholars, we tend to think of it as, would it have made a difference if it was imposed a year before? Because that, of course, affects who enters the election as well, and gets us beyond just looking at, you know, what happened in the snapshot once the candidates were already in place. I mean, Larry, you promoted ranked choice voting, so I'm going to ask you to lead on this, but I know Rick has some authority here as a New York City resident as well, and may want to weigh in on this too.
Well, I mean, the obvious points to be made are, first of all, that Mamdani won a majority of the vote. It was a bare majority, but so in terms of the three, I think for many New Yorkers, unsatisfying choices, you know, there's no electoral reform that would have changed that outcome. But I do believe, and it gets to a point Rick was making earlier, and then he can expand on it in the New York context. I have to believe this was not an elevating choice of candidates for many New Yorkers. And I have to believe, you know, that, you know, maybe some kind of Mike Bloomberg figure, perhaps without his money, might have gotten in the race if they thought that they could have had a chance. The other point I want to make, Brandice, is that I think probably virtually every one of our 30 or so task force members would have agreed that partisan gerrymandering of electoral districts is a really unseemly and should be antiquated practice in a democracy. And California had adopted nonpartisan redistricting under Schwarzenegger and felt very good about it. I was strongly in favor of it. So for this proposition that Newsom sponsored to win with nearly 2/3 of the vote, it's really a commentary on the political context we're in now, both in terms of a perceived, you know, downward slope in democratic norms, and of course, rising political polarization.
Rick, as our New Yorker, and I don't know.
Yeah, so as a New Yorker, so one of the questions I get a lot is, why did New York City adopt ranked choice voting for the primary election, but then not use it in the general election, not adopt it for the general election? And as Larry has said, it wouldn't have made any difference in terms of, you know, but by the time we got to the final choices, actually, even in the primary, Mamdani won the Democratic primary so overwhelmingly that he would have won it without ranked choice voting, and the general election, it wouldn't have made a difference. But the reason we don't have it in the general election is that we also have fusion voting, in which two parties can cross-endorse the same candidate. The candidate runs under both party labels. You can vote for the candidate under either of the two labels. So for example, Mamdani ran in the general election under the Democratic Party label, but he also ran under the Working Families Party's label. That's a party that's been around for a long time in New York, that's kind of to the left of the Democratic Party. And political reformers in New York, rightly or wrongly, thought it would be too confusing for voters when you have fusion candidacies to also ask the voters to rank those candidates. So I think that if you take Mamdani as an example, if voters liked him, would they rank him one under the Democratic Party, but then rank him one again under the Working Families Party, which would actually not be a valid way to vote under ranked choice voting, because you only get, he's one candidate. So I think that kind of shows in an interesting way that some political reforms can actually be in tension with other political reforms, and you can't necessarily have everything you want. And if you're a big proponent of fusion voting, as a lot of people in the reform community are right now, there may be some tension between that reform and the use of ranked choice voting. At least that's what reformers in New York City thought. So that's why we have it in the primary, but not in the general election. Larry brought up, gerrymandering. We have been talking about polarization and extremism. I think gerrymandering is bad for lots of different reasons, but one of the problems with it is, as many as we know, you have lots and lots of legislators who end up in very safe seats for their party. And in safe seats, they don't worry about losing the general election. They only worry about the primary election. And if we go back to these unrepresentative primary electorates, what this does is it gives incumbents or candidates strong incentives to appeal to that primary electorate, which may be more extreme than the general electorate. And they try to preempt those primary challengers if they're an incumbent by moving to the polls. And so I think in all of our debates over the last decade about partisan gerrymandering, which is a problem in terms of fair partisan outcomes, we've lost track of the importance of another very significant dimension in districting, which is the importance of designing districts where we can that are actually competitive districts. And in competitive districts, when members run, they have incentives to appeal to the sort of the tipping point in the electorate. If the tipping point's in the center of the electorate, they're accountable to voters. If they lose 5% support, 5 points of support, they may lose. If they're in a seat that they regularly win with 70% of the vote, losing 5 points doesn't mean anything. So among political reforms to combat extremism, I would put an emphasis on designing competitive election districts up there as an important dimension for this problem. And as I say, it's just we've lost track of that in our discussions about gerrymandering because we became so focused on what the partisan outcomes are likely to be. You can have a system that is fair in partisan terms, outcome terms, where everybody gets elected with 70% of the vote and no one's in a competitive district. And I don't think that's healthy for the democratic system. And I think that does contribute to polarization and extremism.
Yeah, I mean, not to always bring it back to California, but actually prior to the reforms that Larry was talking about on the redistricting, California was known as an incumbency bias state in a lot of its redistricting. And states have these different patterns. Some are trying to jam in sometimes, the majority party's seats, but some actually decide we like ourselves. We want to kind of protect ourselves and have an incumbency bias, and that creates a kind of, as you're pointing out, a very separate set of issues. Ned, I want to have you have the last word on this question, kind of the recent elections, before we move to the audience questions, which are accumulating quickly. So if you want to say anything about New York City, but also New Jersey or Virginia, and even moving forward, how to think about, I know there's kind of what the lessons learned are broadly, but also in our context, what the lessons are in terms of, polarization. I know we're looking at governors who are when we look at some of these, who are in competitive districts, so to speak, right? So the lessons learned from the governor's races may or may not apply to what's going to happen in the congressional midterms. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I think there's a clear national lesson from yesterday's election, and it's in relationship to what happened in 2024. Trump way overread his mandate. The verdict in November of 2024 was that the majority of the country did not want either Biden or Biden's vice president. The only
Right.
choice they had to register that sentiment was an extreme MAGA candidate named Trump. Again, any other, whether it's Hogan, Manchin, Haley, anybody else who was perceived as not associated with the Biden administration and coming at it from, a less blue perspective, was closer to purple or red, would have prevailed in the same way that Trump did. And so he had a mandate to govern on immigration and inflation and other things that was different from how the Biden-Harris administration had been governing. But it was not a mandate to do all of the extreme things he's been doing. And he's not the only example of either a president or a majority party in Congress way overreading the results of an election because of the distortion effect that Rick talked about at the outset. It's very easy to overinterpret election results under our current system in a polarizing way. And that's happened a lot over the last couple of decades. And so what happened yesterday was the natural reaction to the electorate saying, no, we don't want to go that far. And yet our system is unable to find that middle ground because of how it's structured. And so looking ahead to 2026, we can look at races where it's kind of obvious that there's a desire for a more middle ground candidate, and yet the system is doing what political scientists call the center squeeze. So look at John Cornyn, who's not a moderate, but he's more moderate in Texas than Ken Paxton. But there's a Republican primary there that's forcing Cornyn to turn himself into something that he's not in order to try to get out of the primary into the general. He would clearly be the Condorcet winner. I mean, I don't know, 100% clearly. Maybe a Democrat could be the Condorcet winner, but I think that's unlikely. But, he has to change himself in order to try to make it out of the primary. Cassidy in Louisiana is the same situation. He may be a collateral damage of our current electoral system, even if he would be the Condorcet winner in Louisiana, meaning the candidate most preferred of all the other options, Republican or Democrat, that might be on the ballot next year. Tom Tillis retiring in North Carolina, same thing. North Carolina has done this in several cycles now. So unless we really diagnose the problem correctly and then figure out the right remedy for it, we're going to have this wild oscillations, relatively wild oscillations, but sometimes political scientists call it leapfrog representation, that just is, and it's why the public is so frustrated, because they want something that's in between and they just can't seem to get what they want.
Yeah, thanks. We've got some great questions. We're going to try to get to as many of them as possible. One of them leads pretty directly off of some of your recent remarks on gerrymandering. So one audience member asks about how electoral reform with either kind of with ranked choice voting and or Condorcet voting jives with gerrymandering, and that is concerned that it seems like this gerrymandering leads to more extreme candidates when a party's candidate is almost certainly going to win in the general election. So I guess the question is, how does ranked choice voting and Condorcet voting kind of counteract gerrymandering if it's happening in what is already highly gerrymandered district?
Well, I would say these are kind of separate but related issues.
Yeah.
So if you have the form of partisan gerrymandering where everybody is in a safe seat, then no matter what form of voting you use, ranked choice voting, Condorcet voting, the standard plurality voting, the outcome is going to reflect the fact that you're in an extremely red or extremely blue district. So I think we need to address gerrymandering, but addressing gerrymandering doesn't mean we should also not address the kind of voting systems that we use. So I think one is not a salve for the other. I think, both are desirable. I don't think we should stop pursuing one if we can't get the other. But gerrymandering is a significant problem of its own, and it won't be cured by ranked choice voting or Condorcet voting.
Yeah, and I agree. We have to tackle gerrymandering where it occurs, and that's, as Rick said, is an independent, definite goal given the desire to avoid polarization and extremism. But the way in which to realize that fixing gerrymandering doesn't solve the problem is to think about Senate elections or gubernatorial elections, which are not affected by gerrymandering. You don't district the Senate, and yet if you look at how the Senate, the center of the Senate is getting hollowed out, and has been over the last 2, 4, 6, 8 years. That's not a function of gerrymandering. That's a function of the first past the post system combined with partisan primaries. It caused Rob Portman to have to leave in Ohio. You can talk about this affecting Tennessee and Arizona and a whole bunch of states where there was a more moderate Republican usually who just gets squeezed out of the system, but still would be the most preferred candidate, who would be majority preferred against either a MAGA Republican or a Democrat, but can't prevail under the current system.
This builds one question related to this is whether there's a realistic pathway to gerrymandering being, let's say, if not eliminated, reduced. Larry, your earlier comment about California proposition, the recent proposition.
I'm going to make a general statement here as a political scientist, and then I'm going to ask my 2 election law professor colleagues to comment on this. But I've been informed about 2 things that I think are very interesting. One is that the Democrats in the House have actually introduced a bill to require independent commissions to draw congressional district boundaries in all the states. I know this because I actually recommended this to a Democratic member of Congress and was told it was introduced, but of course it went nowhere. The fact that they have made nothing of it in this national kind of controversy that was ignited by Trump's pressure on Texas to redistrict is shocking beyond belief, frankly. It's almost political malpractice. The second thing I'm told by a Stanford colleague in the law school that Ned and Rick know well is that it would probably be viewed as constitutional by the Supreme Court if the Congress mandated that. But that part I'm not so sure about, and I pass over to my colleagues.
Well, recent events have made this issue much, much tougher to solve, because first, there was an effort to get the US Supreme Court to hold partisan gerrymandering a violation of the federal Constitution. I was actually part of the legal team representing Common Cause in that litigation. And the Supreme Court held that federal courts do not have the power. This is a 5-4 decision. The Supreme Court held that federal courts do not have the power to address partisan gerrymandering. So that took a potential national solution off the table. The other source of a potential national solution, as Larry said, would be Congress, but it seems highly unlikely Congress is going to pass significant gerrymandering reform. So then you're left with reforms at the state level, and a significant amount of that reform had actually been taking place at the state level. So voters in some states had adopted independent commissions to do districting. In some states, they had amended their state constitutions to ban partisan gerrymandering. That's actually true in New York. It was true in Florida. But the problem is, if these reforms are adopted disproportionately in blue states or red states, but in this context, it's blue states, it becomes a form of unilateral disarmament if you can't get a uniform solution across a lot of states. And so you see these independent state commissions unraveling now under the pressure of all the intense politics around gerrymandering. So once the Texas legislature decides to engage in this mid-decade redistricting, then there's all this pressure in California. Let's bypass the commission that voters had adopted. Tell voters we want you to adopt a new plan. There will be a much more aggressive Democratic partisan gerrymander, which is what just happened. And so we had been making progress on constraining partisan gerrymandering state by state, but state by state approaches are sort of inherently unstable if they're not adopted broadly across a number of red and blue states. And so we're really in a box right now.
And I'll just add that several of the Washington Post columns I wrote in 2021 and 2022 was that Congress should focus specifically on gerrymandering and not a lot of other electoral issues. As you may remember, when Biden won and the Democrats had both the Senate and the House, but not a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate, they put forth an 800-page huge albatross of a bill that had been sitting around since 2018 as a fundraising device that was clearly not going to get any Republican support, and it didn't, and tried to ram that through. And it was a disastrous waste of a moment of opportunity. What should have happened is a laser focus just on the problem of gerrymandering, and by the way, to answer the constitutional question, under Article 1, Section 4, Congress clearly has the power to enact an anti-gerrymandering rule for congressional elections. There may be some specific details about it how it would do that might raise some collateral 10th Amendment issues under the so-called anti-commandeering doctrine, which we're not going to get into, but that's debatable whether even that doctrine applies to Article 1, Section 4. But there would be a way to create an anti-gerrymandering law applicable to congressional districts that would be perfectly constitutional. And I thought there at least should have been an effort to try to get 60 votes in the Senate at the time, which would have required 10 Republicans to join the 50 Democrats in the Senate. Because again, the Republican senators are not themselves gerrymandered. They don't really have a direct stake in that fight. They may want to support their party, but they had just come off the insurrection and the impeachment vote, and it was clear that there needed to be some effort to help stabilize and improve American democracy. There ought to have been an effort just to focus on stopping gerrymandering in the congressional level, and it was just a tragic missed opportunity. Then here we are as a result.
Ned, we have a question. Actually, Mo Fiorina was mentioned earlier in the webinar, and I don't think any of us, I certainly wasn't aware he was on the webinar, so that's always a nice surprise. And he has a question for you, which is that he's not familiar with the legal literature on Condorcet winners, but from what he remembers about the theoretical literature, Condorcet winners only exist under certain assumptions, and voters need, and some of these assumptions can be restrictive, and that voters need to make 3 head-to-head choices in a 3-candidate election, but 6 in a 4-candidate election. And beyond that, it becomes totally impractical. So he's asking you, what is he missing?
No, that's correct. And that's why you would use a ranked choice ballot if you had certainly 5 candidates, and even I would say, as a practical matter, you would have to use a ranked ballot for 4 candidates. And the difficulty on the voters' part to casting a ranked ballot would be no greater difficulty. The voter would do the identical thing. And then what the computer would do would be to construct the head-to-head competitions from the rankings, because on every ranked ballot, for each pair of candidates, one is ranked higher and one is ranked lower. So it's not hard for the computer to generate the Condorcet competition out of ranked ballots. The point of my illustrating the 3-candidate example is that is a context where you could use a direct Condorcet ballot if you wanted to avoid ranked ballots for whatever reason. There's just this cultural animosity at the moment to ranked ballots, unfortunately. So yes, that's a solvable problem with the use of ranked ballots. The other point is also a completely accurate point. There are rare, the political science shows us that it's very rare to happen, but it can theoretically happen that an election does not have a Condorcet winner, meaning that there is no single candidate who is majority preferred compared to each opponent considered one-on-one or head-to-head. And so any Condorcet system would have to have a subsidiary principle to how to handle that situation. There are several different ones that could be used. The easiest one to use is one that finds the candidate closest to the Condorcet winner by having the least bad defeat, least bad head-to-head defeat. So in my 3-candidate example, if it somehow strangely happened that each candidate had one head-to-head victory against each of the other, you pick the candidate whose margin of defeat in their single defeat was the narrowest margin. So they came closest to those two victories. So they're kind of closest to the Condorcet winner. Another way to resolve this problem, which is, piggybacking on what Larry said, is you could simply say, pick the IRV winner, unless there's a different Condorcet winner, and then you pick the Condorcet winner. But if there isn't a Condorcet winner, then you just default to the instant runoff winner. So that's another way to handle this issue. There's a third way called bottom two runoff, which is a particular type of Condorcet voting, which always has a definite winner, whether they're the Condorcet winner or not. So the Condorcet principle leads to a family of alternative electoral mechanisms to comply with the Condorcet principle.
So let me offer a
Thanks.
friendly.
Okay. Yeah, I
Is
think
time?
I'm being told we're out of time, so that's where
Okay.
I don't. Can you say it in 15 seconds or?
I can. I think there has to be a strong premium for simplicity here in an era of election denialism and suspicion. And so Ned's third alternative, which is endorsed by the Nobel Prize winning economist Eric Maskin, of the bottom up competition from the bottom two finishers, each running a in head-to-head contests until you get to the top. It's a better way to do it, I think.
Thanks. Thanks for this great conversation. And we have a lot of great questions we unfortunately couldn't get to, including on topics very near and dear to REI's heart on civics education, campaign finance. We have a host of webinars coming up, many of which will touch on those, not just touch on, but delve into some of those subjects in more detail. So I'm going to, hopefully we will see you then and get your questions answered at that point. Erin?
Thank you, Brandice, Larry, Rick, and Ned. Thank you to the audience for your participation and great questions. If you're interested in diving more deeply into the concepts discussed today, feel free to purchase Electoral Reform in the United States, Proposals for Combating Polarization and Extremism. Thank you to our events team for your assistance, and I want to remind you that this recording will be available on Hoover event page in the next few business days. Our next webinar will focus on reclaiming liberal education on Wednesday, December 3rd at 10 a.m. Pacific with Senior Fellows Peter Berkowitz and Brandice Canes-Wrone. We would encourage you to visit the series webpage and sign up for the next session. You can access the recordings of previous webinars, subscribe to the RAI newsletter, and receive updates on upcoming events. Thank you everyone for joining. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll see you next time.